This week on the show, we're talking about loot boxes and monetization. So I'm joined again, once more, by Ben Joy, the investigative journalist of the Play team, who brings his findings and his facts and his opinions to the show. And we're going to talk about loot boxes. So why don't you kick us off, Ben? What's the deal with loot boxes?
So firstly, I'm sure everyone is aware, but just in case they're not, what a loot box is basically like a virtual treasure chest, which you can buy either for regular human money or like in-game currency. Typically, it is regular human money, which is what everyone calls it. For an undisclosed item, basically, you don't know what you're going to get. And they are quite contentious. They make a lot of money. It was estimated in 2018 by Juniper Research that the global spend on loot boxes was going to reach 50 billion by the end of 2022, which is next year. So it's a decent chunk of change for the gaming industry, but there is quite a lot of contention around them because there are large sectors in and out of the industry who believe that it constitutes gambling and it's wrong, it's ethically wrong. There's some back and forth about whether they're right or not. As it stands currently, they're still legal, but the risk is that it's going to be, if it's labeled as gambling, the game's not over, but the game is significant.
Yeah, I guess if these things are judged to be gambling, then they would incur all sorts of restrictions that you maybe wouldn't want on your loot box game. Like, I guess where it becomes a grey area is with underage people, people who are underage to gamble. Like, consenting adults can do whatever they want, but when it's a child with access to their parents' account, is it the right thing that they should be able to, win skins and sell them in some cases on an open market? So there is like a finite amount of money associated with these things at times.
Exactly. The problem you have there, as soon as it is made, if it gets labelled as gambling, anyone under the age of 18 cannot participate. And a lot of these games are, they're on 3+ games. So does the age rating of the game change? How do you police that? It's a minefield, and I don't know what the correct answer is. I have some opinions. I'm not saying I'm an expert because it's a difficult one. So what's happening at the moment is in July of 2020, there was a call for it by the House of Commons to be labelled as gambling. Following that, the government has essentially done a call for evidence where they have given, I think it was an 8-week period, asking a bunch of questions about gamers' experience, potential harms, what current measures are in place to kind of limit any risks. And essentially then they will look over all that evidence and they will make a decision as to whether it will be classified as gambling or not.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, the Gambling Commission are saying it's not gambling for the reason that what is in a loot box is not cold, hard cash, and the virtual things inside them do not have a monetary value, so it can't possibly be gambling. The other side of the argument is you are wagering on something that you don't know necessarily what the outcome is, which tiptoes into the definition of what gambling is.
And we know that some of these things do have financial value. Like there is an amount that people would pay for these things. Like the FIFA Ultimate Team is a good example because EA have said for a long time that it's not money that's being exchanged here. But when you can sell one of those cards for £2,000, like if that's you're not supposed to be able to sell them, but they clearly have a value associated with them to a lot of people.
Exactly. Something is worth what someone is willing to pay for it. And we see that for these rare items, people will pay into the thousands. So therefore, it has a monetary value. I think they're going to say, well, we haven't set the price. The market is setting the price. But either way, as far as I'm concerned, that has a monetary value. So you can see where it gets into a grey area very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And the Gambling Act 2005, they categorize gambling under a number of sectors, of which I've written them down, which is arcade, betting, bingo, casino, lotteries, and gaming machines. And I've looked through kind of the definitions for each, and it is very difficult to place a loot box into one of them. And which is, I guess, why it's coming up with resistance, why it hasn't just been like, yep, you're right, it's gambling. So it's a very difficult area. And there are big companies like EA who are very much against the stance that it's gambling, and they liken it to funnily enough, they liken it to it being like a Kinder Egg. If you buy a Kinder Egg, there's a treat inside. You don't know what it is. So they're essentially saying, how is what we're doing any different to that? And when you put it like that, there's a part of your brain that goes, that's a good point.
I will pay you £2,000 if you get this. You get a specific Kinder Egg thing on the inside. That's what I want. I'm collecting them.
But then, obviously, when you go a bit deeper, like with Kinder Eggs, it's like you've got like a chance of 1 of 6 of getting it. And yes, you can keep buying and buying and buying until you get the 6. But chances are you'll get the 6 eventually. When you go down the route of loot boxes, things have different levels of how rare that they are. And that's when you can get into the cycle of when you want something valuable and it's rare, you have to buy and buy and buy and buy and buy.
For some people.
And you might never get it. And it is, you hear the horror stories of people who spent thousands and thousands of pounds, kids who don't know the impact, and they're spending hundreds to thousands of pounds of their parents' money, not really knowing what they're doing and the impact that it's having. And you can rack that up really, really quickly and still not get still not get what you were looking for. And
Pete in the chat.
There are numerous.
Sorry, I was just going to say that Pete in the chat's made a good point that like it's not the first time that there's been stuff that's aimed at children, which has this kind of surprise mechanic. Like Pokemon cards were really big in the 90s and early 2000s. I guess they probably still are big somewhere. And a similar kind of vibe there, where you're not buying specific cards, you're buying a chance to get the card of your dreams.
Yeah. So there's been some measures kind of voluntarily put in place, shall we say. So as we talked about earlier, there's a probability value for everything in a loot box. Kind of the publisher or the developer can set what the probability value is, be that 0.5%, 1%, 5%, whatever. And historically, there has been no requirement for that to be publicized. So you could literally have like a 0.1% of winning something in a loot box, and you have no idea. You just know it's rare. But now anything in the App Store or the Google Play Store, any games that have loot boxes in, they are required to put a probability measure on the loot box. And the big platforms, Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo, they all pledged, along with a bunch of developers as well. I don't have the full list of developers, but the big platforms, along with an initiative with Yuki, they pledged for 2020 that any new games going onto their platforms with loot boxes would have to do the same. And I think there was a quote from Yuki about the importance of self-regulation. Obviously, it's going to be a lot of back and forth in the government as to whether it's going to be branded as gambling. Obviously, people in the industry who are profiting off it don't want to see that happen, but equally, there are people in this industry who recognise the need for self-regulation, and at least these kind of steps are being put in place to try and limit any damage, kind of trying to get that win-win scenario where companies can still make money off of this, but try and give consumers more of an awareness of what they're doing and what they're getting involved in.
Yeah, and I guess there's a sense among a lot of developers that if the industry could self-regulate, then it's less likely that the government will force regulations upon them, which is probably what they don't want, because it's better to set your own terms and to be left alone than it is to be forced to act in specific ways by legislation. You talked about the UK's response in terms of the House of Commons and the kind of call for evidence that they're going through at the minute. What about other governments around the world? Like, what are they saying elsewhere in the EU and in America? Have you got any stats on that?
Yeah, so interestingly, Belgium decided they've got very, very strict gambling laws in Belgium. So it's maybe no surprise that they were one of the first to do this. But Belgium have banned loot boxes. Like, you cannot do loot boxes in Belgium. It's just not allowed. I believe you can still have them if it's done with in-game currency that you've earned from playing the game, because you've earned it. You're not spending any hard cash. But they've essentially said, nope, you cannot do loot boxes in this country. And from reading reports stuff around it, like, gamers aren't upset about that. It's fine. Developers seem okay with it. And essentially, what I was reading around it is that gamers are not sorry to see the back of it because they didn't necessarily enjoy it. Even those that participated in it, it wasn't necessarily an enjoyable experience. It was just they were trying to enhance it, and that was a way to do it. It wasn't like, oh, I'm having so much fun with this. So they're quite happy to see the back of it, and that's been in place since 2018. So that's not something new that's happened. So
I suspect companies will care a lot more if more companies follow Belgium's lead. Because I mean,
yes,
they're extremely lucrative, aren't they? Like, I guess.
Oh, absolutely.
We've talked about the price of gaming before and how much games cost, and the trend towards monetization of individual items has been like a real seismic shift in terms of how some games make money. You look at something like, like Fortnite, for example. Fortnite is free. Like, the money they make is on items. And there are a lot of games out there that trade heavily, and FIFA is one of them. Like, games that trade heavily on microtransactions, and loot boxes are a big part of that. Do you have any figures there about the kind of the scale of loot boxes in the industry?
I do, yes. So as I said, it's expected globally to be free and spend. I think what you said there was a really interesting point about the free to play. That's kind of where it all got started, and that's where the free-to-play games make their money from. Purchases and loot boxes is one of those, and then it's come across into the console gaming sphere and the PC gaming, where you've bought a game and then you can buy more. And I think that's one of the problems that consumers have with it. It's like, I've paid you anywhere between £40 and £70 for this game, and now you're making me buy more, essentially to enhance my gaming experience, or in some instances unlock things in the game. That's kind of what kicks it off in Belgium. There was the big hoo-ha about Star Wars Battlefront 2, where there was really high-profile characters like Princess Leia and Darth Vader that you could only get in a loot box, and that doesn't sit well with consumers when they've paid a lot for the money. Yeah. EA is an interesting example, because we talked about it in the news that there is the scandal going on with someone in EA is selling these items from loot boxes for thousands and thousands of pounds. And EA in 2020, $1.49 billion of their net revenue came from FIFA Ultimate Team alone. That's 27% of their entire revenue, just from that one mechanic in one of their games. So that just shows the scale of it. And EA is a really interesting example, because obviously this scandal is and I was reading an article earlier, and GI Biz have kind of written quite a scathing article about what's going on with it, because obviously EA have naturally come out and condemned this, and this is really bad, we're going to do something about this, and the individual is going to be punished. And kind of the article is saying, that's great, but essentially what's happening is someone on an individual level is doing exactly what your business model was set up to do. Have people spend thousands of pounds for something really rare.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like EA are now in a really difficult position, because they're condemning what's happened, because what is happening is there's no argument of what is happening is wrong. But then people who are on the anti-loot box side of things now have a weapon in their armor to go, well, what is what they're doing that different from what you are doing? They're just doing it on an individual scale, as opposed to this is your business model. So really shaky ground, and it gets, as I've said a couple of times already, it gets really grey very, very quickly.
Yeah, and outside EA, I mean, I guess it seems like it's an industry-wide thing that there's a lot of loot box spend, and I guess we're expecting to see a lot more in the near future. Yes,
we are. What is interesting is, and I think this gets amplified, and it gets amplified because you hear the horror. It's but with anything in any industry, you hear the horror stories. That's what makes the news. What makes the headlines. Ofcom released a report in the middle of 2020. And their report said in the UK, only 6% of children who play games and 4% of adults who play games have ever engaged in loot boxes and made a purchase. So that's a really small number. But that doesn't take away the fact that people still have problems with the ethical side of it. And it's potentially worrying that, although it's only a small amount, children are more likely to spend money in games and have maybe less awareness of the impact and actually what they're doing. And there is an argument that could say, if you're getting involved in that at an early age, you set your behaviors when you're young. So if that's something you're engaging with from maybe as young as 6 years old, if you're playing FIFA and you kind of get into that habit, it is easy to see why it can become really destructive really, really quickly and have a big impact on someone's life. As I said before, there are lots of arguments made over and over again. There are links between loot boxes and gambling addiction and gambling problems. So yeah, while the numbers seem small, that's not to play down the potential negative effects it can have and why people are so anti-loot box.
Yeah, and I guess it almost puts into stark contrast, like, if it's that small in terms of the percentage of players, but the profits are that high, you think, well, how much are these people spending? Like, how much are these, they talk about them as, like, whales, like, how many people who are really hooked into the system, they must be spending a lot of money to make it worthwhile.
Yeah, I wish I'd written this down. There was a game, I can't remember what it was. They'd said you could spend you could realistically spend, I think, like £1,000 a week, £5,000 a month. And if you're really invested, like, that can go very quickly. You can do that very quickly. And there was a guy who put a request into EA, kind of a request for his information, and he found out he'd spent like £10,000 over the space of 2 years, like on FIFA Ultimate Team. And he's like, that wasn't worth it. And I guess the problem is if you're doing it like little and often, like £8 here, £10 there, like that can add up really quick, and you could essentially find yourself with a problem without realizing that you have a problem. So yeah, it's a really slippery slope. I'm not sure which side of the fence I sit, because
I feel like you're slamming loot boxes. You're like,
I know, but
you're slamming EA as well, which I feel like you do every time I get you on the show. I'm like, cool it with the anti-EA stuff, Ben.
No, I'm they won't give us FIFA. But no, like I said, I can very much see the argument and I can see the negatives. But on the other side, by the law, it's not doing anything wrong. There are measures that can be put in place to limit spending. There are locks that parents can put on games to limit spending. So it is really into a grey area where is it the business's responsibility to stop people from spending their money, or should people be able to do that themselves? That said, you can see how incredibly addictive it is, and should businesses be exploiting that? That's the two different arguments, and I can see both sides to an extent. So I'm not making a groundbreaking, this is the side of the fence I sit on. I'm just going to sit on the fence as normal.
Well, there you go, folks. Ben Joy hates loot boxes, and he hates you if you use them.